France, May 27, 1940, 07:42 a.m. Behind a crumbling stone wall near the village of L'Épinette, a British officer is waiting. Through the morning mist, 5 German soldiers are advancing toward his position. The world around them is ending. The German Wehrmacht has already crushed Poland in 36 days. Their Panzer divisions are currently tearing through France at a rate of 40 miles per day. The entire British expeditionary force is collapsing, running for their lives toward the sea at Dunkirk. In every ditch along this road, officers are burning classified documents. Sergeants are burying equipment they can't carry. Private soldiers are throwing away their rifles just to run faster. But this officer, he isn't running, and he isn't holding a rifle. In his hands, he holds a 6-foot English longbow, 70 pounds of draw weight, a weapon that belongs in a museum, not on a modern battlefield against machine guns and tanks. But Captain Jack Churchill isn't interested in modern warfare. He is an expert archer who represented Great Britain at the World Championships in Oslo just 11 months ago. He knows he can put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. The German patrol is now at 30 yards. Churchill can see the sergeant leading them. He watches the Germans scan the hedges, checking for rifles, checking for machine guns, but he never thinks to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill draws the string back to his ear. His fingers find the anchor point he has practiced 10,000 times. He has made this shot countless times at paper targets. He has never made it with a human being at the other end. The arrow flies. The German sergeant drops without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century, and it would be the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. It happened because one man refused to accept that modern technology had made the warrior spirit obsolete. This is the story of Mad Jack Churchill, the man who brought a sword to a gunfight and won. The British Army simply did not know what to do with a man like Jack Churchill. On paper, he was a professional soldier. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. He knew the drills, he knew the regulations, and he knew how to lead men. But there was a problem. Jack Churchill was bored. For a man of his temperament, peacetime soldiering was not a career, it was a cage. The endless inspections, the polished boots, the polite dinners in the officers' mess, it exhausted him more than any battle ever could. So, in 1936, he did the unthinkable for a career officer. He quit. For the next 3 years, Churchill drifted through the world like a character looking for a story. He moved to Nairobi, Kenya, and worked as a newspaper editor. He appeared in movies as an extra, playing an archer and a bagpipe player, even landing a small role in the film The Thief of Baghdad. He once rode a motorcycle 1,500 miles across Burma and India, a journey that ended only when he crashed into a water buffalo on a rural road. He was restless, hyperactive, and searching for something that the modern world couldn't seem to offer him. Then came September 1939. Germany invaded Poland. War broke out. And for the first time in a decade, Jack Churchill found exactly what he was looking for. He immediately rejoined his regiment. But he did not return as a normal officer. When he packed his kit for France, he didn't just pack the standard-issue webbing and revolver. He packed a longbow, the same one he had used to compete in the World Archery Championships. He packed a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during his years in Burma. And most famously, he packed a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword, a claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries earlier. His fellow officers looked at him with a mixture of confusion and horror. They thought he was eccentric at best and mentally unstable at worst. His commanding officers saw him as a liability. After all, the British War Office had no regulation covering officers who wished to carry medieval steel into battle against panzer divisions armed with 88mm cannons. But Churchill didn't care what they thought. He wasn't doing this for attention. He was doing it because he had studied the history of warfare more deeply than any of them. He knew the statistics. He knew that a modern Mauser rifle was more accurate than a longbow at long range. He knew a German soldier could fire 15 rounds a minute while he could lose perhaps 10 arrows. But Churchill understood something that the tacticians in London had forgotten: the power of the human mind. In close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, in the sheer terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychological warfare mattered just as much as raw firepower. You know the sound of a rifle. You know the sound of a machine gun. You have trained for years to react to these sounds. But what do you do when an officer charges at you out of the smoke, screaming a Highland war cry and swinging a broadsword? There is no training manual for that. Your brain freezes, you hesitate, and in that split second of hesitation, you are dead. Churchill knew that a man who could kill you silently with an arrow before you even knew he was there possessed an advantage that no amount of modern technology could match. He wasn't bringing these weapons to be nostalgic. He was bringing them to be terrifying. And as the British Army began to collapse around him in 1940, he was about to prove that his madness was actually a very specific kind of genius. The evacuation of Dunkirk was a miracle, but it was also a humiliation. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of France. But look at what they left behind. They left their tanks. They left their artillery. Most of them left their rifles. They came home defeated, exhausted, and expecting a German invasion on British soil within weeks. The army was broken. The spirit of the nation was hanging by a thread. But amidst that sea of broken men, Jack Churchill walked off the transport ship standing tall. He came home with his bow, he came home with his sword, and he came home with his bagpipes. While others had thrown away their weapons to run faster, he had used his to cover the retreat of his company. He had looked the enemy in the eye, and he was not afraid. Within weeks of returning, Churchill heard rumors of a new unit being formed. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, demanded a force that could strike back at the enemy, even if only to prove that Britain was still fighting. They were to be a steel hand from the sea. They called themselves the Commandos. The recruitment poster didn't promise glory. It promised danger. The missions would be suicidal raids into Nazi-occupied territory. The casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic. It was strictly volunteers only. Jack Churchill didn't hesitate. He volunteered immediately. He joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and was sent to the rugged mountains around Achnacarry Castle in Scotland for training. If Dunkirk was hell, Achnacarry was a different kind of torture. The training program was designed to break men. It was brutal beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted before. They marched 30 miles a day carrying full equipment over mountain peaks. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water until their skin turned blue. They learned to kill silently with knives, garrotes, and their bare hands. And this wasn't a safe environment. To simulate the stress of combat, they fired live ammunition over each other's heads during exercises. Men who could not keep up were simply sent back to their original units in disgrace. But Jack Churchill didn't just survive the training, he thrived in it. He was older than most of the other volunteers, a man in his 30s surrounded by 20-year-olds, but he was stronger and more determined. He could march longer, he could shoot straighter, and he could fight harder. And he brought skills that no other commando possessed. While other men were cleaning their Lee Enfield rifles, Churchill was practicing with his longbow, putting arrows into targets at 200 yards with lethal precision. While others were resting, he was playing the bagpipes, the mournful sound echoing through the Scottish glens. At first, the other commandos didn't know what to make of him. Was he showing off? Was he crazy? But as the weeks of brutal training went on, they began to understand. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on actual operations. Surprisingly, the commandos said yes. They realized that Churchill wasn't carrying ancient weapons because he thought they were superior to guns. He was carrying them because he understood the nature of fear. He knew that war was about psychology. A German soldier facing a rifle knew what to expect. He had trained against rifles. He understood the threat. But a German soldier facing a screaming madman with a sword and bagpipes, he had no training for that. His mind would freeze for a critical second while he tried to process what he was seeing. And in combat, a second of hesitation meant death. By the autumn of 1941, the training was over. Churchill had been promoted to second in command of No. 3 Commando. The men were ready. The steel hand was forged. Now it was time to strike. The target was a small island on the Norwegian coast called Vaagso. It was a heavily fortified German garrison. It was about to become the stage for one of the most audacious raids of the war. And leading the charge would be a man with a sword, ready to prove that sometimes the oldest ways of war are still the deadliest. In November 1941, the order came down from Combined Operations Headquarters. The commandos were no longer just training, they were going to war. The operation was codenamed Archery. The target was Vaagso, a small but strategically critical island on the frozen coast of Norway. This wasn't just a raid, it was a message. Vaagso controlled the entrance to a network of fjords that German ships used to transport iron ore from Sweden, the raw material for Hitler's war machine. The town of South Vaagso was also home to fish oil factories that the Nazis were using to produce glycerin for explosives. The plan was audacious. Royal Navy cruisers would bombard the coast. Royal Air Force bombers would provide air cover, and Jack Churchill's No. 3 Commando would land on the beaches at dawn to wipe out the German garrison. But Churchill had a specific request. He wanted to lead the very first wave onto Malloy Island, a small, heavily fortified rock guarding the harbor entrance. And he requested permission to do it while playing his bagpipes. The senior officers questioned his sanity, but they granted the request. On Christmas Day 1941, the commandos boarded their transport ships and sailed north into the Arctic darkness. The voyage was brutal. The temperature dropped well below freezing. Ice formed inches thick on the deck railings. For 2 days, men huddled in their quarters, checking their Thompson submachine guns, sharpening their knives, and trying not to think about the fact that they were sailing straight into the teeth of the German defenses. At 08:45 a.m. on December 27th, the transport ships reached the launch position, 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. The landing craft were lowered into the black, freezing water. Churchill took his position in the bow of the lead craft. He checked his equipment one last time. Broadsword at his belt, grenades, revolver, and in his hands, the bagpipes. As they approached the shore, hell broke loose. The cruiser HMS Kenya opened fire with her 6-inch guns, thundering salvos over the heads of the commandos. Explosions lit up the Norwegian coast like lightning. RAF bombers dropped smoke canisters to blind the German gunners, creating a curtain of white fog along the shoreline. In every other landing craft, men were crouching low behind the steel gunwales, praying the German artillery wouldn't find them. But not Jack Churchill. He stood fully upright in the bow of the lead boat, exposed to the freezing wind and enemy fire. The shore was 200 yards away, then 100. At 08:48 a.m., the ramp of the landing craft crashed down onto the rocky beach of Malloy Island. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into the freezing surf. He didn't fire a gun. He didn't shout an order. He put the pipes to his lips and began to play the March of the Cameron Men. The sound was otherworldly. It cut through the roar of explosions and the rattle of machine gun fire like a blade. It was the most Scottish sound in the world, screaming out on a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The Germans in the shore battery were stunned. They had trained to fight soldiers. They had not trained to fight a myth. They paused, just for a moment, trying to understand what they were hearing. That pause was their undoing. Churchill finished the tune. He calmly set down his bagpipes. He pulled a grenade from his belt and hurled it at the nearest German bunker. Then he drew his broadsword. With a scream that matched the fury of his pipes, he charged up the beach. "Commandos, attack!" His men surged forward behind him, inspired by the sheer madness of their commander. They swept over the German positions like a tidal wave. The fighting was close, brutal, and fast. The assault on Malloy Island took less than 10 minutes. Churchill led from the front, clearing bunkers und gun emplacements one by one. Die 4 massive Coastal-Artillerieguns wurden destroyed mit Demolitionscharges. Bei 9 Uhr am, die Island war sicher. Aber der Battle war nicht over. Across den Narrow Strait, in dem Town von South WWII, dem Main Assault Force war in Trouble. German Reinforcierungen hatten der Town in eine Fortress gemacht. Sniper waren feiern von every window. Machine Gun Nests covered den Narrow eisige Sträte. Die britische Avance hat gestallt. Churchill gathered his men und kommandiert eine Landing Craft, um den Wasser zu überqueren. Ankam zu finden Chaos. Immediat deployed his Commandos, persönlich leiten eine Flankungsattacke down eine Side Street, sword still in hand. Imagine the scene, smoke billowing from burning fish oil factories, der Air thick mit dem Smell von Cordite und friesendem Schallspray. Und ein British Officer rennen von Cover zu Cover mit einer mittelalterlichen Sword, routing die Wehrmacht von deren Positionen. Die Germans fielen back. They couldn't hold the line against attackers attacking from multiple directions with such ferocity. By mid-afternoon, the town was cleared. The factories were destroyed. Code books were captured. Over 100 prisoners were taken. The raid was a complete success. It was the first major commando victory of the war, but it came at a cost. 17 commandos lay dead on the ice. 53 were wounded. Churchill emerged from the smoke without a scratch. His sword was bloodied. His bagpipes were undamaged. The news of the raid reached Berlin. Adolf Hitler was furious. He became paranoid about the defense of Norway. He ordered 30,000 additional troops to be diverted to the Norwegian coast. 30,000 soldiers who could have been fighting in Russia or North Africa. A single raid, led by a man with a sword, had tied down an entire army division. The legend of Mad Jack was no longer just a rumor in the British mess halls. It was a terrifying reality for the German High Command. But Churchill was just getting started. His next destination was the Mediterranean, where he would face even greater odds and perform a feat that would seem impossible even for him. By the summer of 1943, the legend of Mad Jack was no longer just a rumor. After the frozen fjords of Norway, Churchill took his medieval arsenal to the scorching heat of the Mediterranean. He led No. 2 Commando through the invasion of Sicily, marching across the island with his longbow slung across his back and his broadsword at his waist. But the true test came in September 1943, during the invasion of Italy at Salerno. The landings were a disaster. The Germans were waiting. Panzer divisions pinned the Allies down on the beaches. The entire invasion force was in danger of being pushed back into the sea. Churchill's commandos were thrown into the line to defend a critical rail junction at the town of Vietri. For 5 days, they held out against relentless German counterattacks. They fought from ruins, from ditches, from cellars. But there was a problem. High above the town, in the hills near the village of Melina, the Germans had established a fortified observation post. From this high ground, they were directing devastating artillery fire down onto the British lines. The order came down. The post must be eliminated. Any standard officer would have looked at the map and ordered a company-sized assault. They would have sent 100 men charging up that hill, supported by mortars and machine guns. Jack Churchill looked at the terrain and realized that was suicide. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach. A large force would be spotted and slaughtered before they got halfway up the slope. So Churchill decided to do something that defied all military logic. He decided to take the hill with 2 men, himself and a single corporal. His reasoning was simple. 2 men can move where an army cannot. 2 men can be ghosts. They left the British lines after midnight. It was pitch black. They moved through the brush, crawling through drainage ditches, climbing over stone walls, inching their way up the mountainside. This is where the story shifts from a war movie to a psychological thriller. The Germans on that hill were relaxed. They were deep in their own territory. They had sentries posted looking for an army, not 2 shadows. Just before dawn, Churchill and his corporal reached the first enemy position. It was a mortar pit. Churchill could see the glow of cigarettes in the dark. The German soldiers were talking quietly, unaware that death was standing 3 feet behind them. Churchill didn't shoot them. Gunfire would alert the whole mountain. Instead, he drew his claymore. He stepped out of the darkness, a tall, imposing figure looming over them with a raised sword. Imagine the sheer cognitive dissonance for those German soldiers. They turn around expecting a relief guard, and instead they see a demon from the Middle Ages. Churchill screamed at them, not a frantic scream, but a command. Hände hoch, hands up. The Germans were so shocked, so completely unprepared for this specific nightmare, that they surrendered immediately. Their minds couldn't process the threat fast enough to reach for their weapons. But Churchill wasn't done. He now had prisoners. Most men would have taken them back to base. Churchill used them as bait. He took his revolver lanyard, a simple leather cord, and tied it around the neck of the German sentry, leading him like a dog on a leash. He gave the prisoner a choice. Walk to the next post and tell your comrades to surrender or die. They walked to the next machine gun nest. The German sentry called out. The next group of Germans looked up, saw their comrade, and then saw the wild-eyed British officer stepping out of the gloom with a sword. Panic is contagious. Confusion is a weapon. One by one, the positions fell. Churchill moved from post to post, collecting prisoners like a grim reaper collecting souls. He repeated the process again and again. Approach silently. Reveal suddenly. Demand surrender. By the time the sun fully rose over the Italian hills, Jack Churchill and one corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. 42 men, captured without firing a shot, captured by a sword and a piece of leather string. The march back down the hill was a surreal spectacle. Churchill walked at the head of the column. The prisoners carried their own wounded on carts. When they reached the Allied lines, the British sentries couldn't believe their eyes. They thought it was a hallucination. Churchill later described the scene in his diary with characteristic understatement, saying it looked like an image from the Napoleonic Wars. For this action, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The official citation praised his leadership and courage, but it left out the most important part. It didn't mention that he had done it all with a sword. Perhaps the British High Command was embarrassed to admit that their millions of pounds of modern weaponry were being outperformed by a piece of sharpened steel. Or perhaps they simply realized that the weapon wasn't the sword. The weapon was Jack Churchill himself. But luck is a finite resource, and as the war dragged on into 1944, Jack Churchill was about to push his luck one time too many. He was heading to Yugoslavia, to the mountains of the partisans, and there the music would finally stop. By May 1944, the war had changed. Jack Churchill was now operating in the mountains of Yugoslavia, tasked with supporting communist partisans against the German occupation. The Germans here knew who he was. Intelligence reports had circulated through the Wehrmacht headquarters describing a British officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others took it as a warning. The mission was to capture the island of Broadsword. It was supposed to be a coordinated assault. Churchill's commandos would lead the charge, supported by 1,500 Yugoslavic partisans. But when the moment came, the plan fell apart. Churchill landed on the beach and signaled the advance. But the partisans hesitated. They saw the strength of the German fortifications in the hills and refused to move. Churchill was furious, but he couldn't force them. So he did what he always did. He attacked anyway. He led a small group of commandos directly up the hill, into the teeth of the German defense. But this time, the magic ran out. The Germans were waiting. They had machine guns zeroed in on the slopes. Mortar rounds began to rain down with terrifying accuracy. One by one, the commandos fell. Within minutes, Churchill was the only man left standing. He was alone on a hilltop in enemy territory. His men were dead or dying around him. The German infantry was advancing to finish the job. He had no ammunition left. Escape was impossible. Most men would have raised their hands. Jack Churchill sat down on a rock, adjusted his kilt, and picked up his bagpipes. As the German soldiers closed in, the sound of a Scottish lament drifted down the hillside. He played "Will Ye No Come Back Again," a song of farewell. The Germans stopped. They didn't shoot. They were too confused, too curious, perhaps even too respectful of a man who faced death with such absolute composure. They watched him play until a grenade exploded nearby, knocking him unconscious. The music stopped. The Mad Jack of legend was finally captured. The Germans believed they had caught a high-value target. Because of his last name, they assumed he was a relative of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They flew him to Berlin for interrogation, hoping to use him as a bargaining chip. When they realized he was just an eccentric soldier with no political connections, they sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Sachsenhausen was a place of death, but Churchill was placed in Sonderlager A, a special compound for prominent prisoners. There, he met men who had plotted to kill Hitler and survivors of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III. For most men, being thrown into a concentration camp would be the end of the story. For Churchill, it was just a logistical problem to be solved. He didn't wait for the Allies to rescue him. He began digging. Using old stones, pieces of metal, and their bare hands, Churchill and a small group of officers dug a tunnel from a garden drainage ditch. It took weeks of agonizingly slow work, hiding the dirt under piles of compost. On September 23, 1944, the tunnel was ready. It stretched 110 meters, passing right under the electrified perimeter fence. Churchill crawled through the mud and emerged into the darkness of the German countryside. He was free. He paired up with an RAF officer named Bertram James. Together, they decided to walk to the Baltic coast, over 200 kilometers away, hoping to stow away on a boat to Sweden. They moved only at night. They slept in ditches. They ate raw vegetables stolen from fields. For 2 weeks, they evaded the entire German security apparatus. They made it to within a few miles of the coast before their luck finally broke. They were spotted, captured, and sent back to the camps. But you cannot keep a man like this in a cage. In April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Churchill and other high-profile prisoners were moved to the Austrian Alps. The SS guards had orders to execute them rather than let them be liberated. But in a dramatic standoff, a unit of regular German army soldiers, Wehrmacht troops who despised the SS, moved in to protect the prisoners. Outgunned, the SS retreated. The prisoners were free, but they were stranded in the middle of a war zone. Most of them decided to wait for the Americans to arrive. Not Jack Churchill. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He was done waiting. He simply walked away. He walked 150 kilometers through the Italian Alps. He had no food, no weapons, and an injured ankle. He navigated by the sun and by instinct. 8 days later, an American armored reconnaissance unit in Verona saw a ragged figure limping down the road. He looked like a beggar, but he carried himself like a king. He walked up to the Americans and calmly announced that he was a British lieutenant colonel. He had no ID. He had no uniform. But after hearing his story, the sword, the bagpipes, the concentration camp, the Americans believed him. You couldn't invent a story like that. Jack Churchill was finally coming home. The war in Europe was over. But for a warrior who only felt alive in battle, peace was about to become the hardest challenge of all. Jack Churchill arrived home in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The concentration camps were liberated. The Nazis were defeated. The world was celebrating peace. But for Jack Churchill, peace felt like a premature ending to a great adventure. He wasn't done. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific, and Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to carry his sword into one more battle. He wanted to play his bagpipes on one more beach. He was on a ship heading toward Burma when the news broke. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The Second World War was officially over. Most soldiers cried tears of relief. Jack Churchill was bitter. Upon hearing the news, he famously grumbled to a fellow officer, "If it wasn't for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed the truth about his soul. He was a man who thrived in the chaos of combat, who felt most alive when death was closest. Without a war to fight, he was a warrior without a purpose. But the world wasn't entirely peaceful yet. In 1948, Churchill was sent to Palestine. The British mandate was ending, and the region was exploding into violence between Jewish and Arab forces. Here, we see a different side of Mad Jack. He wasn't just a killer, he was a protector. Following the horrific Hadassah convoy massacre, hundreds of Jewish doctors, students, and patients were trapped at a hospital on Mount Scopus, surrounded by hostile forces. They faced starvation or slaughter. Churchill personally coordinated their evacuation. He walked into the middle of the danger zone, not with a sword this time, but with a smile. He successfully evacuated 700 people to safety. When asked how he managed to negotiate in such a volatile environment, he simply said, "People are less likely to shoot at someone who is smiling at them." He retired from the army in 1959. He was 52 years old. A normal man would have taken up gardening or golf. Jack Churchill took up surfing. He became one of the first people in England to surf the Severn Bore, a tidal wave that surges up the River Severn. Local fishermen thought he was insane as they watched this retired colonel paddling a homemade surfboard into the brown, churning water. But for Jack, riding that wave was the closest thing he could find to the adrenaline of the battlefield. His eccentricity never faded. In his later years, he became a legend among commuters on the train from London. Every evening, as the train rattled past his neighborhood, Churchill would suddenly stand up, open the window, and hurl his briefcase out into the darkness. Terrified passengers would stare at him, convinced he had finally lost his mind. They didn't know that Churchill had calculated the exact trajectory. He was throwing his briefcase into his own backyard so he wouldn't have to carry it home from the station. It was a practical, if unusual, solution, just like using a longbow in World War II. Jack Churchill lived to be 89 years old, dying peacefully in Surrey in 1996. He outlived the empire he fought for. He outlived the enemies he defeated. But he never let the modern world tame him. When Jack Churchill died, one newspaper wrote that if he had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. It's true. No fiction writer would dare to create a character this absurd. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks. A man who captured 42 prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns. A man who played bagpipes while mortar shells exploded around him. Jack Churchill wasn't the most decorated soldier of World War II. He didn't change the strategic course of history. But he did something perhaps more important. He proved that even in an era of industrial slaughter, individual courage still matters. He proved that unconventional thinking can overcome superior firepower. And he proved that one man with enough determination can walk through hell playing the bagpipes and come out the other side. He refused to let the modern world tell him how to fight, how to live, or how to die. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every like helps us rescue more forgotten stories from the archives. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Make sure to leave your comments. What was Jack Churchill's greatest weapon? Was it the sword, the bow, or simply his refusal to be afraid? Thank you for watching, and for helping make sure that Mad Jack Churchill does not disappear into silence.